In this series of videos, we'll look at the domestic policies of George Walker Bush, George W. Bush. He was elected in the election of 2000, was re-elected in the election of 2004, and served through the election of 2008. George W. Bush, of course, was born to prominence. His father, George Herbert Walker Bush, had been a previous president. His grandfather, Prescott Bush, had been a senator from Connecticut. Bush went to prep school and off to Yale and afterwards went to Texas and became an oilman. He had some problems with drinking and sort of found religion, became very evangelical. And with his father's connections and his money, he was able to purchase an ownership share in the Texas Rangers baseball club. His connections and money then parlayed him on to the governorship of Texas. And throughout, he remained very devoutly religious and drew a lot of support from conservatives, both fiscally and socially. Aiding Bush's political rise was his chief political consultant, Karl Rove, also from Texas. Rove recognized early the power of Bush's name and connections and helped cultivate his candidacy. Rove was an astute observer of politics and a master of using wedge issues to drive base turnout, and he remained a key advisor throughout George W. Bush's presidency. The Democrats nominated Vice President Al Gore, shown here on the left, and he didn't have much competition, only a token challenge from New Jersey Senator Bill Bradley. Gore then selected as his vice presidential running mate Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman, shown on the right. The Republicans, by contrast, had a number of contenders. The contest eventually sort of whittled down to George W. Bush and Arizona Senator John McCain. Bush selected as his vice presidential running mate the former Wyoming Congressman and Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, shown on the right here. Cheney brought a lot of foreign policy experience that Bush lacked, as well as connections to the more hawkish elements in the Republican Party, sometimes called neocons for neoconservatives. These Republicans believed that it was America's role to spread democracy and a very active foreign policy. Cheney would later play an important role in the emergent war on terror. Despite the presence of the more conservative and hawkish Cheney, Bush ran a campaign that tried to soften the image of the Republican Party. Bush spoke of a compassionate conservatism. In the general campaign, there were several significant third parties that could affect the outcome, including the commentator Patrick Buchanan, shown on the left, running on Perot's old Reform Party ticket, and the consumer advocate Ralph Nader, right, running on the environmentalist-centric party, the Green Party. It was apparent early in the election night on November 7th, 2000, that, the vote would be close and sort of depend on whoever took the delegate-rich state of Florida. The television networks first declared that Gore had won based on exit interviews, but in the early morning hours, as more official results arrived and it's after most people had gone to bed, the networks reversed themselves and declared that Bush had won. But the problem was that votes were still coming in from 3 heavily Democratic counties around the population center of Miami, and the results were getting closer and closer by the minute. By the next day, the Bush lead was only a few hundred votes, which legally under Florida law mandated a recount. The Gore campaign requested a hand recount of these counties, noting that a lot of ballots were poorly constructed and inconclusive, and that even many of them had what's called hanging chads. In the middle here, you can see a ballot, and look where the arrow is pointing. Sometimes it's right between candidates, and it can be confusing. A hanging chad is when you'd have to knock out a piece of the ballot to vote, but the piece wasn't completely removed. The hole wasn't complete. And so, did that person mean to knock out that ballot? That sort of thing raised questions. But Gore wanted a hand recount because of that, and that took time. And Florida State Secretary of State Katherine Harris, who was a Republican and co-chaired Bush's Florida campaign, declared that, the results of the hand recount would have to be submitted by a statutory deadline for amended returns 1 week after the election, November 14th. When the Florida Supreme Court overturned Harris's decision and extended the recount until November 26, the recounting continued. As the recount continued, protests from both sides grew intense. Each side claimed the other was trying to steal the election. It was getting ugly. When the Florida Supreme Court's deadline of November 26 passed, but the recounting was still not complete, Harris refused to consider any recounted votes afterwards and certified, as it was her job to do, that Bush had won the election by 537 votes. 537 votes out of the millions cast. Bush quickly contested the certification. When the Florida Supreme Court then ruled that the counting could still continue, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in the famous case Bush versus Gore that the Florida Supreme Court decision had violated the Equal Protection Clause under the United States Constitution. This ruling in Bush versus Gore effectively ended the recounting and made Bush the victor. Democrats were outraged, noting that the 5 conservative judges who voted in the majority were appointed by Republicans and had ignored their often stated deference to state courts on matter of states' elections. And they argued that the decision of the court was purely political. While many Democrats were still ticked off, Gore thought it was best for the nation not to press the matter further, and he magnanimously conceded the election. The voting recounting controversy and Bush's final victory of only 537 votes aside, the election of 2000 was one of the closest in history. In the national election, Bush won the Electoral College 271 to 266, thanks to the Florida decision, but Gore won the popular vote by approximately 500,000 votes. It was the first time since 1888, when Grover Cleveland had won the election, that an Electoral College victor had not won the popular vote as well, which of course angered the Democrats even further. As an aside, the Electoral College might have been different had not Ralph Nader run. He took almost 3% of the national vote, and these environmentally minded voters probably would have gone to Gore otherwise. In any event, this concludes the first video on George W. Bush's election in 2000.